breaking news. MS Now has just learned that FBI Director Kash Patel may be out of a job in the coming months. 3 people with knowledge of the situation say President Trump and his top aides.
It was supposed to be a normal day in Washington, but it did not stay normal for long. Congress had already taken the first step toward a historic vote, and the tension in the Capitol was so thick you could feel it. Then, the moment arrived. The vote was cast, the results were announced, and the country watched as the unthinkable happened, live on camera. Congress voted for removal, a decision that in any other era would have signaled the end of a presidency. The weight of that vote was not just political, it was symbolic, a declaration that the system was still capable of holding even the most powerful accountable. But then came the twist that no one expected. Trump did not react like a defeated leader. He did not step aside. He did not accept the vote as final. Instead, he refused to resign. He refused to back down. He refused to acknowledge that the power he once wielded was slipping through his fingers. And in that refusal, something changed. The story stopped being about the vote and started being about the man.
The president, a little bit earlier today, talking about Kash Patel during the Turkey pardon.
FBI Director Kash Patel has been very busy and doing a great job. Also, thank you, Kash.
Because now, the question was not just what Congress did, but what Trump would do in response. Would he comply? Would he negotiate? Or would he ignite a constitutional crisis that the country has not seen in modern history? The truth is, this moment was always going to be a test of strength. But the vote did not test him. His reaction did. And with one sentence, he made it clear he was not going anywhere. Now the real conflict begins, because when a leader refuses to accept the rules have to respond. And Washington is not built to allow a president to simply ignore the law. The halls of Congress went silent, then erupted. The White House staff began to panic, and the country watched, stunned, as the power structure started to wobble. At that moment, the question was no longer about politics. It was about the future of the presidency itself. The vote was not just a political event, it was a seismic moment, a rare and powerful signal that the system was moving against a sitting president. When the final tally came in, the room went quiet. Not the quiet of relief, but the quiet of shock. Because in Washington, people are used to fights, to negotiations, to backroom deals. But this was different. This was a clear, public declaration that Congress was ready to take away the highest office in the land. And then, the real shock hit. Trump did not accept it. He did not even pretend to. Instead, he stood up and made it clear he was not stepping down. He refused to resign, and in doing so, he turned the vote into a moment of national crisis. This refusal was not just about pride, it was about power. Trump has built his entire identity around control, and he has never tolerated being told what to do. Now, he was facing the most powerful institution in the country, and instead of stepping aside, he chose to challenge it. That decision immediately changed the tone of the story. It turned a political outcome into a constitutional conflict. Because if a president refuses to comply with a legal decision, the government must decide how far it is willing to go to enforce it. And that is where the danger lies. Because enforcing this kind of decision is not just a matter of paperwork. It is a matter of authority. It is a test of whether the institutions of government still function when faced with direct defiance. Within minutes, the White House started to scramble. Staffers began making calls. Advisors started trying to figure out what to do next. And behind the scenes, the legal teams began assessing the fallout. Because the question was no longer about whether Congress could remove a president. The question was now about what happens if a president refuses to accept that removal. The country watched as the power structure began to crack. And the message was clear. The fight was only just beginning. As soon as Trump refused to resign, the White House atmosphere changed instantly. The calm of a typical political day evaporated. The people in the building began to move faster, and not in a coordinated way. It was panic, pure and simple. Staffers started running from room to room, trying to figure out what to say, what to do, and how to contain the situation. They were not just dealing with politics, they were dealing with a constitutional crisis. The kind of crisis that forces you to ask questions you never thought you would have to ask. What do you do when the president refuses to accept the will of Congress? How do you enforce a removal vote without sparking chaos? Who speaks for the administration? And how do you keep the country from falling into a deeper, more dangerous conflict? The security teams, the legal teams, the communications teams all began working at once. But the problem was not coordination. The problem was that they were facing a leader who refused to follow the rules. And when a president refuses the rules, the government becomes unstable because the whole system is built on compliance. And while the staff tried to manage the situation, the public began to react. The moment went viral. People in the streets, on social media, in living rooms across America began to watch in disbelief. The country suddenly realized that the rules were being tested and the outcome was uncertain. This was not just a political moment, it was a psychological one. Because Trump's refusal was a signal to his base that he was not giving up. It was also a warning to his opponents that the fight was not over. And it was a message to the world that the United States might be entering a period of instability unlike anything seen in modern times. The vote itself was only the beginning. The real battle was about to unfold in the courts. Because once Trump refused to resign, the question became not whether Congress could remove him, but how the removal would be enforced. The legal teams on both sides immediately prepared for war. The question was no longer about policy or popularity. It was about constitutional authority. And that is where things get complicated. Because there is no clear, simple roadmap for this kind of crisis. The Constitution provides mechanisms, but it does not fully explain how to handle a president who refuses to accept the result. And when the law is unclear, the power struggle becomes even more dangerous. Lawyers began discussing emergency orders, enforcement actions, and even potential arrests. The idea of a president being forced out of office is already dramatic, but the idea of a president being forced out against his will is even more extreme. The courts would now have to decide how far they were willing to go. And every decision would set a precedent. If Trump was allowed to defy the vote, the system would be weakened. If he was forced out, it would send a message that no one is above the law. But enforcement would not be easy. It would require coordination between branches of government, and it would require the willingness to use force if necessary. And that is the part that makes this situation so dangerous. Because when the government has to use force against its own leader, the country becomes unpredictable. The stability of the system is no longer guaranteed. The reaction from politicians was immediate and intense. Trump's allies began to defend him, framing the vote as a partisan attack and calling it illegitimate. They used every platform available to push the narrative that this was a witch hunt, that the system was corrupt, and that Trump was being targeted unfairly. On the other side, his opponents celebrated the vote, claiming it was a victory for democracy and accountability. They argued that the law had been upheld and that the president had finally been held responsible. But the truth is that the reaction was not just political, it was emotional. Because Trump's refusal to resign was not just a policy stance, it was a statement of identity. It was his way of saying he would not be controlled and that he would not be removed without a fight. And that is why the political landscape began to shift. Because the vote did not end the debate. It intensified it. It turned the country into two opposing camps, each one more energized than before. The media coverage was also explosive. Networks, commentators, and pundits began analyzing every angle, every possible outcome, and every potential crisis. And the more they talked, the more the public became aware of how serious the situation had become. The political fight was now in full swing, and it was no longer about winning elections. It was about the future of the presidency and the rule of law. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. People across the country reacted with shock, anger, fear, and disbelief. Some saw Trump's refusal as a heroic stand, a symbol of strength against a corrupt system. Others saw it as a dangerous act of defiance that threatened the entire structure of American democracy. Social media erupted. The news went viral. The country was flooded with videos, memes, and heated arguments. People were no longer discussing politics. They were discussing the survival of the system. And the more the public reacted, the more the situation escalated. Because when emotions run high, rational discussion becomes difficult. The nation became polarized in real time, and the division was deeper than ever. Some Americans began to fear that this could lead to violence, that the country might face protests, unrest, or even armed conflict. Others believed that the system would hold, that the law would eventually prevail, and that the crisis would end without major consequences. But the reality was that nobody could be sure. The situation was unpredictable, and the future was uncertain. And in that uncertainty, fear began to spread. The public was watching, and the public was afraid. Because the moment Trump refused to resign, the country realized that the rules might no longer apply. Once Trump refused to resign, the focus shifted to enforcement. Who would act? Who would step in to carry out the decision? And what would happen if Trump refused to comply? The answer was not simple. Enforcement would require cooperation between multiple branches of government. It would require the military, the Justice Department, and federal agencies to act in a coordinated way. And it would require officials to follow orders that could put them in direct conflict with the president. The problem is that the president controls much of the government's power. So enforcing a removal vote would require officials to turn against the person who controls their jobs, their authority, and their future. That is why the enforcement question is the most dangerous part of this crisis, because it forces people to choose between loyalty to the president and loyalty to the law. And when people are forced to choose, the system becomes unstable. The government becomes fractured, and the country becomes unpredictable. The enforcement question is not just legal, it is personal. It is a test of whether government officials are willing to put the Constitution above their own careers. And that is a test the country has never fully faced in modern history. The world was watching. Allies and rivals alike were paying attention to the crisis unfolding in the United States. Because the US is not just a country, it is a global power, and its stability affects the entire world. Allies began to express concern, and some began to question whether America could continue to lead. Rivals, on the other hand, saw the situation as an opportunity. They saw a moment of weakness, a chance to exploit the instability for their own benefit. The international community began to wonder whether the US government could function effectively if the president refused to comply with a removal vote. They began to question whether the country could continue to maintain its alliances and commitments. And the longer the crisis continued, the more the world began to doubt America's stability. The US was suddenly seen as a nation in turmoil, a country where the rules could be broken by the person at the top. This international reaction added another layer of pressure, because Trump's refusal was no longer just a domestic issue. It has become a global concern. In moments like this, the story becomes the battleground, because whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome. And Trump has always understood this better than anyone. He used every platform available to push his message, to frame the vote as illegitimate, and to paint himself as the victim of a corrupt system. He rallied his supporters, energized his base, and turned the crisis into a political weapon. The media, meanwhile, became divided. Some outlets supported the vote and criticized Trump's refusal. Others framed the vote as a partisan attack and defended Trump's decision to stay. The result was a media war. Every day brought new headlines, new analysis, and new arguments. And the more the media argued, the more the public became divided. The narrative became the most important part of the crisis, because the story would determine whether the country would support enforcement or resistance. and it would determine whether Trump would be seen as a defiant leader or a dangerous threat. Now, the country is waiting for the next move. Trump has refused to resign, Congress has voted for removal, and the legal system is preparing for enforcement. The question is no longer whether this will end, but how it will end. Will Trump continue to resist? Will the government move forward with enforcement? Will the crisis escalate into something even more dangerous? The truth is, nobody knows. The future is uncertain. But one thing is clear. The moment Trump refused to resign, the country entered a new era. The rules have been challenged, and the system is now being tested in a way it has never been tested before. And in that test, the outcome will determine the future of the presidency, the future of the country, and the future of democracy itself. Because this is not just a political fight, it is a battle for the rule of law. And the world is watching.